People today imagine the time of Jesus as a distant spiritual fairy tale, a glowing pastoral world of sandals and sermons, miracles and moral poetry, framed in soft sunlight and holy silence. But this comforting image is dangerously incomplete, because for the people who actually lived in that world, survival was not shaped by theology but by money, not by abundance but by scarcity deliberately engineered by power. And Jesus was not born into a peaceful religious sanctuary but into one of the most financially aggressive extraction systems humanity had ever constructed. An empire that did not simply conquer territory but converted entire populations into revenue streams. And Rome did not rule by armies alone, it ruled by invoices. By the 1st century, the Roman Empire had become something the world had never seen before, a fully integrated global extraction machine, a system of roads, ports, shipping lanes, census registries, tax codes, and legal monopolies designed for one purpose only: to pull wealth from the outer provinces into the marble arteries of Rome itself. And every conquest, every governor, every law, and every alliance was measured not by justice or stability but by how efficiently it increased the flow of tribute into imperial vaults. Judea was not merely occupied land. It was a fiscal pipeline, a revenue territory, a productive zone whose population existed primarily as an asset class to be managed, taxed, and leveraged, and its poverty was not natural, nor accidental, nor temporary, but structural, mathematical, and intentional. Because when a land is taxed beyond its regenerative capacity, scarcity becomes permanent, and poverty becomes policy. Most families in Judea lived on small ancestral plots passed down for generations, land that carried not just economic value but spiritual identity, burial rights, tribal lineage, and social belonging. And these families operated on margins so thin that a single drought, a delayed rain, a pest infestation, or a Roman requisition order could erase survival itself. Yet taxes were still due regardless of harvest conditions, because Roman taxation was not tied to productivity but to obligation. An obligation was enforced by law, violence, and imprisonment. Unlike modern income taxation, ancient taxation was layered onto existence itself, meaning people paid land taxes simply for owning land, crop taxes for growing food, livestock taxes for owning animals, tolls for using roads, tariffs for moving goods, head taxes for being alive, emergency levies for imperial wars they did not support, then day laborers, then beggars, then invisible, while over generations land consolidated into massive estates owned by elites loyal to Rome and the temple hierarchy, proving that the poor did not fail by chance but were processed by design, converted from citizens into tenants, from tenants into dependents, and from dependents into expendable surplus. The result was not simply economic inequality but total social disintegration, because once land ownership collapsed, political voice, marriage prospects, legal standing, and community protection collapsed with it, creating an underclass trapped not just in poverty but in permanent vulnerability. The Jerusalem Temple, often imagined today as a purely sacred sanctuary, functioned in reality as the most powerful financial institution in Judea, operating simultaneously as treasury, court, tax authority, currency exchange monopoly, sacrificial supply chain, and political mediator. And every Jewish male was required to pay a temple tax in a specific silver coin, which forced mandatory currency exchange and exchange fees, generating profit while simultaneously controlling liquidity, while approved sacrifices were sold at controlled prices, making forgiveness itself a price transaction. And because high priests were approved by Rome rather than selected by spiritual merit, the institution that preached holiness was structurally welded into the extraction machine that was crushing the population. A system that was not hypocrisy but design, where faith was monetized, debt was normalized, and suffering was reframed as divine testing rather than engineered scarcity. Jesus did not speak metaphors to starving peasants. He spoke survival economics, speaking about debt forgiveness, jubilee, shared labor, mutual aid, radical generosity, and collective provision. And when he overturned the money changers, he was not attacking commerce but exposing sacred extortion, calling it a den of robbers because monetization had replaced justice. And this made him more dangerous than any armed rebel, because swords threaten borders but ideas threaten legitimacy. And once legitimacy cracks, the entire structure of extraction begins to destabilize from within. Within decades, Judea erupted into revolt. Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was torn down, its treasury seized, and its priesthood erased. Yet something irreversible had already shifted, because people no longer believed suffering was destiny, no longer believed debt was moral failure, and small communities formed around shared meals, shared resources, debt relief, and mutual survival. Parallel moral economies living inside the empire but refusing its logic, leaving Rome ruling land but losing the story. And empires do not collapse simply because they are cruel, but because people stop believing cruelty is necessary. And when extraction is no longer accepted as divine order, legitimacy cracks. And once people see the machinery behind power, they can never unsee it. Daily life in Judea was defined by the constant pressure of extraction, a rhythm of survival measured not in seasons or celebrations but in payments and deadlines. to determine whether there would be enough grain to pay taxes, enough sheep to satisfy levies, enough coins to purchase forgiveness, and enough hope to see the next sunrise. Children were not shielded from this economy. They inherited debt almost as soon as they could walk. Sons learned the precise weight of coins and the ritual of payment. Daughters watched their families shrink into dependency and witnessed firsthand how scarcity shaped marriages, dowries, and the very prospects of life itself. Poverty was intergenerational, yet it was also engineered to feel like divine will. Because when scarcity was normalized and debt was framed as moral failure, the oppressed internalized the system, perpetuating compliance without rebellion. Women in this system bore a unique and invisible burden beyond the physical labor of maintaining households, tending livestock, and processing crops. Women were responsible for managing the family's resources in a world where every coin, every grain, every animal could be demanded by external authorities at any time. Their work was often monetized indirectly. Dowries could be claimed, family inheritance diminished by default, and widows faced the worst of the extraction system with no legal recourse. Temple taxes and Roman levies did not consider gender, but their impact was multiplied on households already stretched thin, forcing women to navigate scarcity with ingenuity and endurance while ensuring that children survived, debts were met, and the family retained some claim to land. A precarious balancing act performed daily in silence. Roman law itself was an instrument of extraction, codifying dispossession and legitimizing the seizure of land, livestock, and even homes for unpaid obligations. Debt contracts were rigid, irreversible, and often intentionally opaque, creating a system where knowledge itself was a form of power. Families could unknowingly fall into traps engineered by tax farmers, losing property they had occupied for generations to those with legal cunning and imperial backing. Courts were rarely impartial, operating instead as extensions of fiscal enforcement, ensuring that extraction was not merely tolerated but celebrated as an application of law and divine order. In this context, the high priests, Roman officials, and local elites functioned as collaborators in a system that merged religious legitimacy with economic coercion, converting faith into a tool for control. It is in this landscape that the words and actions of Jesus gained their real potency. His parables were not abstract moral exercises. They were economic critiques dressed in metaphor, weapons against a system designed to crush hope. When he spoke of the poor inheriting the kingdom, of debts being forgiven, of talents being multiplied through stewardship, he was outlining a framework for survival outside the logic of Rome, a vision of an economy rooted not in scarcity imposed by authority but in mutual care, shared labor, and equitable distribution. The story of the prodigal son was a radical illustration of debt relief. The feeding of the multitudes, a blueprint for communal provision. The overturning of the money changers' tables, a public indictment of financialized holiness. To the Roman authorities, these were not harmless teachings. They were threats to the very legitimacy of control, the kind of destabilizing ideas that armies could not crush and laws could not easily contain. Over time, as extraction intensified, villages began to dissolve under the weight of compounded debt. Families who had once been self-sufficient became tenant farmers, renting land they had inherited, paying portions of crops to landlords who themselves answered to Rome. Every failed harvest, every unexpected levy, every illness could tip households into permanent dependency, reinforcing a cycle that trapped generations. Communities attempted to respond by pooling resources, forming informal cooperatives, or creating local charities. But even these were fraught with risk, because collaboration could draw the attention of authorities or be undermined by those who profited from individual despair. In essence, the empire did not merely take wealth, it reshaped social relations, converting solidarity into liability and survival into a tactical negotiation with power. The destruction of the temple in 70 CE was catastrophic not only spiritually but economically. The temple had functioned as both regulator and central bank. Its collapse meant that the traditional mechanisms of economic stability, trust, and credit were violently removed, leaving local populations even more vulnerable. Elite estates expanded further, consolidating wealth and land, while smallholders disappeared into anonymity. Yet, even in this void, networks of resistance and mutual aid persisted. Jesus' teachings had sown ideas that could not be erased, inspiring communities to innovate systems of credit, redistribution, and solidarity independent of imperial oversight. Debt forgiveness, shared harvests, and community-managed resources became forms of moral and economic resistance, living evidence that legitimacy could be challenged without swords or armies. This period also reveals the psychology of empire. Rome could seize land, enforce tribute, and execute rebels, but it could not seize belief. It could not dictate how people understood justice, debt, or survival. The empire relied on internalizing fear, compliance, and acceptance as natural states. And when those internalizations broke down, so did the subtle power that held communities in place. The destabilization caused by ideas, teachings, and acts of communal defiance demonstrates a principle that resonates across time. Control over resources is reinforced by control over perception, and once legitimacy is questioned, the machinery of extraction becomes vulnerable. even if the physical infrastructure remains intact. By tracing these economic structures from tax farming to debt inheritance, from temple commerce to land consolidation, we begin to understand that the world Jesus inhabited was not a spiritual fairyland but a fully functioning economic battlefield. Suffering was methodically produced, poverty was systematically enforced, and survival was constantly at risk. Yet within this harsh reality, visions of justice, collective provision, and debt relief emerged as revolutionary tools, capable of subverting the very systems designed to perpetuate scarcity. These lessons are not only historical, they resonate with modern economies, reminding us that financial systems can be as coercive and destructive as armies, that legitimacy is maintained as much by belief as by force, and that true power lies in challenging both the mechanics of extraction and the narratives that justify it.